And let me switch over to the slide deck. Is there anyone who can't see the title slide, the solving track planning issues and problems?
Good. Quite visible.
Quite visible. Anybody having difficulty at their end? John, I saw a thumbs up from you. Thank you very much for that. I'm just going to remove the video so it would make it less obstructive of the slides. Well, Pat and I are taking slightly different approaches to this topic, but this is the unifying theme. We're going to try to look at some planning issues that we've certainly encountered and some of the somewhat common and novel solutions that we came up with to our specific situations. Just before I delve into the specifics of my presentation, just want to acknowledge off the top the contribution of one of our WOD members who's on this clinic call as well, Pete Beggs, at a meetup that we had in November of last year, suggested that he'd love to see a clinic on this very topic. So thank you for that suggestion, Pete. And as well, there was an anonymous modeler who approached the WOD booth at the Kitchener Train Show in I guess it was November of last year. And his question for us was there anybody in the organization that could help him plan the electrical side of his layout? And after answering a couple of questions, it became apparent that he had already laid out all of his track on his bench work and was now addressing the electrical. And I thought, in terms of what I've learned over the last 5 to 8 years on my layout here in Baden, Ontario, that very clearly his sequence was not what it needed to be. Pat and I are dividing the topic between us. I'm doing part 1, and Pat will, at about 7:45, take over with part 2 of this presentation. My layout is going to be the focus then of the first part of this clinic. And just before I leave the title slide, take a look at the consist and count the number of units, the locomotive units. That's going to be a part of the planning process because I am modeling the prototype. And this shot was taken in early 1980s. Therefore, the CP unit in the middle of this consist, CP became sole owner of the TH&B in 1976. So I've divided my presentation up into these 3 essential topics. It seemed to me that it was worth sharing the approach that I took in terms of overall planning. I'll give you just a quick overview of what the layout looks like. So some of the other specific comments about problems will become a little, hopefully, easier to understand and fit together in the terms of the overall puzzles. And then, of course, we'll conclude with some solutions that I tried to develop and have had the help of others developing to solve those problems. What am I hoping to achieve? Well, I think one of the things that became very clear to me as time went on, both in my previous layout and this one, is the role that creative problem solving plays in trying to overcome issues and problems that we have. And there are a number of approaches to creative problem solving, some formal, some just a matter of using time and kind of playing with ideas. But to me, it's all part of the same thing. And then the other thing I want to try and emphasize, and I know Pat is as well, and that is planning takes time. And trying to think ahead and be organized helps as well. So let's just take a look at what I set out to do. So the HO scale was locked in from my earlier layout. I wasn't going to go smaller to N. I didn't have space, as you'll see in a moment, for O scale, and I already had a lot invested in HO. So that was a given. This is a prototype layout. I modeled the TH&B railroad, and so that carried on from my first layout to this newest one. The purpose, though, is a significant change for me. I was very much a novice when I started my first one in 1988. It was around a room, and it was just a matter of building it and doing something with one of my sons. but I had to shut that layout down and dismantle it in 2007 and was away from the hobby until about 2014. And toward the end of my stint working outside of Canada, I must have stumbled on an article somewhere and became aware of the operational side of model railroading. Prior to that time, in fact, until 2015, I never operated on anyone's layout. I really didn't know a lot about what was involved. But the benefits of having a layout that you could operate seemed twofold to me at the time. And this is back in 2012. One is that you can actually use your layout after it's built. It's not just like a painting on a wall that you admire. The second thing is the social aspect of coming together with like-minded individuals who are interested in the hobby and doing this kind of thing. I thought it would be enjoyable, and indeed, it has proven to be over the last couple of years. The locale, again, because this is a prototype railroad layout, is somewhat set as well, of course. For those not familiar, the TH&B Welland subdivision is this red line from Hamilton to Welland. The Dunnville line I added in, going from Smithville down to Port Maitland on on Lake Erie. And I also added in, you can just kind of see it over here, this green line. My wife had suggested I add the Robin Hood Mill to a part of the layout, and the CN line was used by the TH&B up into the 1980s as a way to make deliveries to the Robin Hood Mill in Port Colborne. These are some shots of the train. Upper left, the unit train called the Rock Train exiting Kinnear, heading toward the escarpment, the cut up to the top. Right-hand photograph is a photo taken of a particular train going up that cut. And then the bottom left-hand corner is another train having crested the top of the escarpment above Hamilton, now on essentially a straight diagonal shot through Vineland, through Vinemount, excuse me, through Smithville and on down to Welland and onward to Fort Erie and into the United States. The size and shape of the room, that's of course one that is an important variable for all of us who are considering or have actually built layouts. This is, excuse me, what I ended up with. And I apologize in advance. I'm still getting over a cold that I got from grandchildren at Christmas. So if my voice is a bit nasally, I am congested, and I may unfortunately cough from time to time. So the exterior walls pointed out here are poured concrete, and this unusual jut out, I know when Pat saw this for the first time, he said, "What the heck is this?" On the architect's drawing for the house design, I think they called this a nook, and it's just kind of stayed with me. Up on the main floor, this is where you'd have a breakfast alcove off to the side. But you can see one of the issues here is no wall going straight down the side of this room. So those are predetermined by the design of the house itself. The guest bedroom and the bathroom were already in place when we took possession of the house. Everything else below and off this picture, as well as the gym and the tool room, were all constructed by me in the second year that we were in the house once I got finished remodeling the top floor. I had originally had designs on another sort of outside the main activity area that was adjacent to the tool room. However, my wife announced that that space was going to be used for storage, and management assigned me the space that you see here. The grid, by the way, is 1 foot per square. So the room that I ended up inheriting is 20 feet long and 6 feet 3 inches wide. And you'll notice that down here, there's a little jog. And since I had control over the wall that's on adjacent to the train room with the gym, I decided 6 inches was going to be important for the design, as much real estate as I could get. And when I did a footprint of the equipment that we had in the gym, it wasn't going to constrain any of those pieces of equipment either. So it was a win-win, but that resulted in this funny little jog that is pointed out here. Research is easier to do with a prototype, and I think is invaluable in a variety of ways around planning your layout. Those who are doing freelancing, I think probably need to do some kind of a substitute for those of us who are modeling the prototype. This is probably the main Bible if you're modeling the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Railroad, the Norman Helm book, now long out of print. But I was fortunate enough to get 2 copies of the book over the years. Another great source of information is the yearly publication of the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Historical Society called the Ontarian. And it has a wealth of historical and operational information that is a big benefit to a modeler like myself. And as well, at train shows, you can get copies of the employee handbook and timetable, and there's a lot of useful information there as well. In addition to these, resources, the Toronto, Hamilton, and Buffalo Historical Society can also provide photographs like these, and the archivist can also provide you, where they exist, track plans, original track plans for servicing the various industries. And these are particularly valuable because some of these industries, going back to the Second World War, simply no longer exist in the route that I was modeling, the 2 subdivisions. There's, of course, a wealth of things online. And for those who are attending, as Pat pointed out, as we were getting ready for this, no surprise to anyone that the NMRA has this great set of resources, and you can access it without being a member. And yet the number of modelers that I meet who simply don't do very much research and don't do it very systematically on the internet constantly surprises me. And this one, simply this beginner's guide, lays it out soup to nuts in 12 easy to use parts. I started buying up some of the books that are available. You can get them out of the library if you don't want to lay out the money, but I've always been referencing back, less so, I suppose, as I've gained more knowledge. And there's all the other resources that are on YouTube, and Model Railroad Hobbyist digital publication, and all of the various resources clustered around it, including its blog. They're really, really great. I've mentioned it already. It seems to me that creative time, mulling things over in your mind, can't be emphasized enough in terms of its benefit. And having the benefit of the input of other modelers certainly has helped me a tremendous amount. I tend to spend a lot of spare time, here and there, 5 minutes, 10 minutes there, 50 minutes at another, thinking about different problems or issues that I've got. And this started long before I began to do any of the construction. So these are just some of the notes that I made. These are some of them a little nicer. You'll notice the helix design. That's the 3rd iteration. I have a son-in-law who's a PNG, so he was running numbers for me to make sure that I wasn't doing anything that was just plain stupid. The Peter or the Pele Sodborg book gave me the idea of suspending modules on the lower deck off the wall. He calls it a sectional layout. So all different kinds of ideas and the material were coming available. And as I was thinking about ways that I could use them, I was trying to make sure that I wrote them down. Out of the Helm book, this picture of the Kinnear yard as it was laid out. And here's, I think, my final version. This is probably the 4th iteration of my layout for the Kinnear yard. So slowly you build up and improve if you give yourself the time to do that. And for me, it wasn't just a matter of it looking neat or interesting, or even just simulating the real world. I wanted something that was going to help from an operational standpoint, move cars and trains around the layout. Key decisions, the grades. I've got 2 key grades on the layout. I've simulated the escarpment south of Kinnear Yard with a 2.5% grade, and the helix is a constant 2.2%. Power load, I read something somewhere probably early on my return to Canada, but before I started any construction, and it just seemed to me that if I'm going to have a number of different operators moving trains around the layout, I better make sure that I don't run into some of the problems that I was reading about. And I've not experienced it, thank goodness. But from what I've read, if you don't have enough power where you need it, when you need it, you can have short circuits, of course, if you don't have breakers that shut down your whole layout. and interrupt someone who otherwise is not having a problem. And you can run into potentially slow-moving trains, stuttering trains, in some cases, trains that just stop. So I needed to have a sense of how much power was I going to need without overspending and over-engineering. So again, back to the Helm book, looking at what are the kinds of jobs that would run typically on the TH&B in some of the key areas. How many locomotives generally were there on any one of those jobs. And that, by the way, is just an observation I will share. I moved the timing of my layout from my first version set in the 1950s to the 1970s. And as I've learned more about the 70s, it seems to me that it's a second transition era. There's a lot of things that were changing in railroading across North America. And one of the ones I was seeing again and again in the pictures, the photographs of freight trains from the 70s and into the 80s is, as you saw in my title slide, consists of 4 or 5, and in some cases, 6 locomotives. So as rolling stock after the Second World War was getting larger and carrying more tonnage, the development of locomotives, it seems to me, just wasn't keeping pace. Now, I'm not necessarily going to run 5 locomotives in a consist, but I needed to make sure that if I want to have 3 or 4, I was going to have enough power. Once I knew what the jobs were, it's a question of where were they concentrated on the layout and how might that influence the way I lay out the electrical plan, and then how would that translate into the laying of the track. So we end up with a power center under my layout, a repurposed kitchen cabinet. Each of the decks of my layout is its own separate zone, isolated from the other, each with its own power supply, and I use NCE equipment. Each booster is rated at a total of 5 amps. Then each one of the zones is subdivided into districts. So I have a sense of where the traffic activity is going to be as operators move trains around any particular deck in the layout. So there's each separate district is protected by breakers. The bus lines are divided then accordingly with the drop wires going into those respective buses. And ultimately, when I get down to the track, I have to then make sure that there's insulated rail joiners separating not only the zones, but also, of course, the districts inside each zone. So all that is a result of a lot of planning that went on beforehand. And asking questions of more experienced modelers than myself. So this is what the doodle of the zones and the breaker protected districts or blocks ended up looking like. So there's 5 in each one of the zones, upper and lower deck. I even went so far as to estimate those particular zones or blocks that I thought, not zones, excuse me, districts or blocks we're going to have more activity and potentially more draw on the system at any one point in time. These are just estimates. You'll note down here in the lower left, it was a note that I stumbled across in a magazine article or a book somewhere. It suggested that depending on the manufacturer of a particular locomotive, that you could have a draw up to a maximum of 0.5 amps per locomotive. And that's, I gather, an estimate. I wasn't going to get that anal about it. But essentially what that meant then was a 5 amp rated booster, power booster, could handle a maximum of 10 locomotives. However, there's an important caveat. Again, I told you I was remodeling my house, and I completely rewired the basement fully for a variety of different reasons. And I chose to have it inspected by the Electrical Safety Association. This is the rule of thumb used in the electric industry. And certainly if you want to get your plans approved by the ESA, you have to conform with this. And it's essentially this. If you've got a circuit that's rated at 15 amps, you don't put 15 amps worth of draw on it in your house. In fact, you're looking at about 12 amps would be the maximum they would want to see you telling them you're going to have connected, either lighting or whatever it might be, toasters, you name it. Same thing then, it seemed needed to apply to the layout. So you're not drawing on 5 amps, you're actually drawing on close to 4 amps maximum normal usage, which gives you a contingency of 20 should you go over that, and it won't have any adverse effect on your circuit. You may or may not remember in the old days when people would plug too many appliances into kitchen outlets and suddenly start blowing fuses. That's because they got and exceeded the maximum on that fuse. I don't want to do that on my layout, and pre-planning helped get away from that. So what does my layout look like after all the blue skying and the planning? Well, here's an older version of the plans, but it gives you a basic idea of what the lower and the upper decks look like. From the lower deck, if you follow a line that is around the outside here at the bottom, that is the incline, and where it ends at A, it enters the helix, and the helix falls into what otherwise was going to be a disused portion of the nook area. Again, I couldn't figure out how I was going to use this space, and I'll show you why when I show you a photograph of it shortly. So that helix gets, of course, the traffic between the upper and lower decks. So you pick up the helix here at A on the upper deck, and it comes down to a Y that until probably about 2010, I was out of the country at the time, but the CPR chose to remove this Y, but it had been there for decades, located in Smithville. So that's the layout pretty much as it was finalized, and then there's been tweaking and other adjustments that have been made over time, and I'll show you a couple of those as we get going further. And here's an example of it. That circle highlights the Stelco, and you'll note that it started out as DeFasco. There's another change from one steel company to another. That was partly around synergies among customers on the layout. But it's amazing to me, actually, when I think back over time, how much just this one portion of the layout has changed. So I pretty much laid down all of the track that you see here and was looking at adding in the red lines when the pandemic started. So I showed this to a friend of mine who I've been fortunate enough to meet and make over the last few years, Ron Tuff, who in fact is on this call. And Ron, among his other work experiences, was once the yard master at Stelco, but he's also an exceptional modeler and one of the MMRs that we have here in Ontario. So I remember the email that he sent back to me after I sent him a copy of this, and it was something very polite like, I think we can do better. And indeed we have, and it's very much a tribute to his input just on this part of my layout. But one of the things that he did was he managed to increase the tail down here, which has allowed much easier movement of freight in and out of the Stelco layout. He also helped me get rid of the high line. It just was going to be too much track in too little area. And also because of his experience at work, he was able to add in some additional plant, so destinations for internal movement, some more activity for operators, and that's great, music to my ears. And he was also able to get me the prototypical names for all of the trackage internal to Stelco, so it's more prototypical, which was kind of music to my ears. And you'll note the date here as recent as the last operating session in 2023. Someone looked at a part of the track plan, which is actually off of this image, but intersects with the Stelco, and essentially said, I think you can gain another piece of track for Fisher Yard, which is a very busy hub, and just move traffic around differently and still be able to get to National Steel Car. So none of the track is locked in yet in this area with ballast, so easy to make those changes when someone makes a helpful suggestion, and you have an open mind. Here's a quick overview of some of the industry in the upper deck, and then on the lower deck. And what's been really cool is I've developed this layout and the destinations over the last, let's say, 5 years. The amount of synergy between these customers on the upper and lower deck has actually been quite surprising. American Can at the very bottom would be an example. It sent scrap to this little company over here I'd never heard of until I read an article in the Ontarian called Metal and Thermit, and the scrap output from it, which was detinned steel, ended up going over to Stelco. So I've got a nice movement set up just through those 3 stations. Well, let's then conclude with what this is really primarily about, and that is as you get into your planning process, what inevitably are the kinds of stumbling blocks that you encounter? And here I have about 6 of them that I identified I'd run into at one time or another. One of the big problems I had at the outset was how to have proper curves in this very sort of elongated rectangular room, and yet still have enough space on the sides, top and bottom, that I could have some classification yards and I could put some industry in. I knew from my previous layout where I had had a duck under that required me to bend over 90 degrees at the waist, and was going to be difficult back then. It was going to be more difficult when I was in my early 60s. And now that I've moved on from there, I'm really glad that I addressed this early on in the planning stage. The other one that was sort of related to this in the entranceway is how to save space. I wanted to have a workbench outside of the tool room area, essentially where the word under appears, and yet a swing door was going to cut off that space. So that was going to be a problem. How could I solve that? This particular problem, it was really perplexing for me. Um, Doing the lower deck, no problem. But once I decided to have a 2-deck layout, there was no way of supporting the upper deck all the way around its circumference through this part of the basement. No wall. And by the way, I did look on numerous designs at whether I could simply run trackage into this area. And the problem was right here, coming off any track that would be along this wall. The angles here, the degree of the turn was just going to be far too sharp to be able to run mainline trains. So it was a non-starter. Um, I have a number of spots in the layout where reach is an issue, but this is the worst of all. Partly it's a result of my own over ambition, but nevertheless, having started to lay track into that area, how are people going to be able to reach back in there? It's 7 feet from the fascia back to this point. The other thing that I discovered as I learned more about operating, and that's just mainly by reading, is the value various people were saying of having staging. Well, I hadn't planned on staging. How can I incorporate that, having been given this space and started the track designs that you saw? And finally, when I got down to looking at the relationship between the real world and my track plan and the compromises in this piece of real estate, I was running into some compass orientation issues. So number one, so this is a very early track plan, as you can see, March 2016. I had a double track for whatever number of reasons at this end to bring traffic into the then Kinnear Yard. Note that Kinnear Yard at the stage was 5 tracks maximum. You may remember the earlier one that I showed you, which is essentially as it is today, is 10 tracks. Same real estate, just have used it much better. Stelco is not where it is today. It's up further in the upper left, but nevertheless, the problem that you can see that I was uncovering between my ambition to have more yards, classification yards, and more customers, and how was I going to have turns, curves at the end of the room that would allow reasonably good long main freight to navigate. Upper deck as well, again similar. Oh, sorry, this is the lower deck in 2016. So ultimately, I ended up settling on 30-inch curves and adjusting where the track ran on the decks, upper and lower, particularly on the lower. And I also narrowed the aisle slightly. I remember a good friend of mine, Roy Vanderquack, has helped me with a lot of the construction. And I remember standing in the aisle one day and saying, I'd had an idea. Did he think that if we took a little bit of space off of the aisle that it would work? Again, doing some of that blind just with tape measures and trying to imagine what it might look like, putting tape on the floor and sort of thing to help you visualize what the final design might be when you start the construction. And here's Fisher Yard. At one point, it started off as well, being very small. It was 4 tracks, and now you can see that it's considerably more. And provides a lot of, I think, from the operating sessions we've been running, very satisfying activity for one or more trains switching the yard. And this is this change up here that was suggested by someone in November of last year. No duck under, I said, was really something I needed for my body, and just to make entry and exit from the room a lot easier. So this is what you would see if you came to the doorway today. You're looking over the upper deck, of course. This is at 61 inches. There is a bit of a duck, but I can handle it not too badly without straining my lower back. Oops, sorry, advanced slowly, then too fast. So from the inside looking out, the one big kind of aha moment that I had was, oh yeah, I could install a pocket door. I had never put one in a house before, but again, all these walls that are interior were built by me. And it suddenly dawned on me one day that I had a grandfather who had built a house and he had put a pocket door in just for this very reason, that it doesn't swing out into a room and eliminate some real estate or end up causing temporary blockages. And you can see the various tracks that are on the gates and the fact that there are 2 gates. So there is an upper drop-down gate, and this is the end where you see this little red flag. This is the end of the escarpment incline, and where it crosses over by the blue arrow, that's where it comes into the bottom of the helix, which is another kind of benefit that I got. Instead of having the helix begin at the lower deck, it starts partway up. And as a result, I ended up discovering some real estate underneath that I hadn't anticipated. And so there are the heights in the room, and you can see there's a 7-inch clearance between the lower deck and the incline in. The angles that you see are partly just parallax from the way the photograph was taken. And all of these breaks where the gates appear are protected with micro switches. So this is the dreaded nook in the wall, structural steel at the top, and this peculiar multi-sided oval, as it were, out into the backyard from the otherwise straight wall of the house. And the problem was, what was I going to do with this? Well, doing the lower deck wasn't going to be that hard an issue, given that I was essentially using modules either cantilevered off of the wall here or freestanding on tables across the space. But add the upper deck, and now I had this great expanse of real estate that I had to get something across, and it had to be stable. I know just enough engineering to know that load and sag become issues with wood. And I also knew that twisting is another force that can be a problem, not only in wood, but in other structural members. So again, I've got a friend, Roy, who's got a technical engineering background, got a son-in-law who's the same, and I had the internet. And what was really amazing for me was there's all these free online tools that allow you to very easily determine strengths, forces, and loads. At one point, I actually took a bag, a plastic bag, and very, very carefully put into that bag what I thought was going to be the total number of cars and engines for a consist and a freight train going up the helix and onto the upper deck. And then I weighed it using a luggage scale. So how to stabilize this surface, given what was going to be moving across it? Well, one way was to have supports anchored to the ceiling above. I didn't like the look of this kind of forest appearance. An alternative is a series of small legs, but essentially just transferring the obstructions from above to below, and that wasn't going to work. And then I had this literal aha moment. I was working outside the country. I had a free weekend, and this diagram is actually on the original hotel stationery that I used, it dawned on me that engineers build bridges, certainly back in the 1800s and in the early part of this century or the last century, sometimes using composite girders, and they call them box beams or box girders. And that's where you get that webbing that you'll sometimes see in old bridges. So I took essentially the same idea, and down here you'll see the top view of the box beam that I built, and here it actually is. So I've got two pieces of oriented strand board laminated together, glued and clamped, and then screwed and glued to these spacer blocks in between. And on the back side, I have a 2x4 that was the straightest piece of lumber that I could source at the time. Here then is what it looks like looking the other direction with the first of the two modules on top. This was essentially the same design for where the track was going to run that was being used on the lower deck, and the holes in the end is where the electrical feed and other lines would run. And this is what it looks like today. No obstruction, Ma. And essentially, you've got the space being spanned by a bridge. Reach, I mentioned, is a big problem, and this is the worst example of it. 7 feet from the fascia at the bottom to the back wall that defines the Stelco material yard. So how is it going to be able to access track back there for switching and uncoupling? Well, one thought I had is recruit different operators with longer arms. There are some obvious problems here. One is socialization skills, and the other one is I thought there'd be an awful lot of shedding. Then I thought, okay, there's this basketball player from France. Maybe somebody like Wemby would be interested in operating. This guy is 7'2" and has got a huge wingspan, but that probably wasn't going to work either. So for the rest of the mortals like me, all of the turnouts past the 3-foot distance from the fascia are being handled by tortoises. This is an example of the type of mini panels that I've got along the layout. And for uncoupling, I've never used them, and I'm about to start installing either this weekend or next week the Rail Crew brand made by Rapido or distributed by Rapido of the electromagnetic uncouplers. A friend has also suggested I give the in-between rail magnets a try. I've never used them. We'll test it out and see if they'll work. But certainly it's going to make it possible, I'm hoping, to have fairly frustration-free operations back in this area that's so far from the fascia. Staging, I mentioned, was something that when I started on this layout, I didn't know anything about, but certainly was recommended in terms of making your operational movements work more smoothly. So management agreed that I could use a shelf in the gym, which is adjacent to the train room, and there's the capacity that's in place. We have an on-off switch, which allows us to not have power and therefore decoders running all the time when these tracks aren't in use. And there's from the train room side, in this case, a local from CN going to drop off some hoppers from for Robin Hood Mill, passing through from the gym side. The other sort of happy coincidental discovery that came to me one day was, gee, I had this 8-inch vertical space around the outer edge of the nook underneath the helix, because the helix was suspended and started at about the 8-inch above the deck height level. And so that is now where the simulation of the John Street CP yard is situated. And you can see in the lower right-hand corner the security monitoring camera photo of the staging yard down here, just in the early stages of construction, various bottles weighing down cork. And you can see that one of the little mini cams is up over here where the blue arrow is. So that was just sort of coincidental, but again, just thinking, mulling about problems, always wondering what if, and coming up with, in this case, what has been a very beneficial way of using that space, and also adding greater variety and flexibility to the movement of traffic around the layout. The last problem that I encountered as the planning process on paper was reaching the final stages is that the orientation compass-wise in the room is not consistent. And at the end of the day, I looked at how pleased I was overall with the broad strokes of my plan for the train room, and realized that I was just going to have to suspend reality. There would be trains in a certain number of cases that would simply be running in the wrong direction to get from A to B. And I would have to try to provide as much direction in writing as possible to help operators and myself out, quite frankly. So here's the lower deck. The compass gives you pretty much a true orientation. If we were standing on that side of Lake Ontario with a compass, and there are some problems in the room. It is consistent, I should mention, both sides of the room in terms of the compass orientation, but there are problems like this one. The incline is running in the wrong direction. I just could not fit it in to the layout so it would come up and around. And once I realized the benefit of having the helix, the incline end and deliver cars into the helix, it allowed a finishing point for the escarpment, and also helped out in a number of other ways. So I live with it. Similarly, on the upper deck, I have spots that aren't working well. So when you come off of the helix at the Y in Smithville, these are the compass directions as you would expect to find them in the real world. However, on the other side of the upper deck, it's the opposite, which is true to the real world, but still introduces other problems. So when you come in from the Frontier Yard from Buffalo staging yard, you're going in the wrong direction. You should be going from east to west, and in fact, you're going to end up going from west to east when you get around to Quail Yard. And over here at Port Maitland, where there's an important industry that I discovered quite a number of years ago and have really wanted to incorporate from the very beginning. Again, there are some directional issues, specifically when you, in the real world, leave the Y and head south along the Dunnville sub, you should be going north-south. So here's an example of the kind of mini panel diagrams that I've got around the layout to help orient people to that particular area that they're operating in, and the JMRI waybills also try to reinforce that. But again, it changes, and it's less than a perfect world, but such is the nature of building a model train layout. And that brings me to the end of my portion of our presentation. Any questions that anybody has? I'll stop sharing.
Paul?
Yes.
This is Malcolm.
Hi, Malcolm.
Just a comment. When you were talking about the power draw on your layout, you were talking about 5 amp boosters. Those 5 amp boosters are operating at like 16 volts. So it's not the power that you're drawing from your 110 volt circuit. Your power supply that runs those can probably run 4 of those boosters at 16 volts, but it's only drawing about 4.3 amps from your 15 volt breaker on your 110 volt circuit. Follow me? So you can actually have several of those boosters, and you're not drawing all that much power.
Absolutely correct. If you go back in your memory to the diagram that I had of the zone and the breakdown, I decided, partly for financial reasons, that I would limit myself to 2 boosters. So the plan is based on those 2 boosters. But you're right. You are working on the 120 volt side of the system, you are ultimately limited by what you're pulling from the panel. I might say I glossed over it because I was wiring the basement again from scratch, and in some cases ripping out what the contractor had done before. I actually ran 3 separate clean circuits from scratch from the breaker panel into that room. So one circuit alone is dedicated to the power center. But it was really my cheapness, Malcolm, that I limited myself to 2 boosters.
Yeah, because you got lots of power, especially with 3 circuits then.
Yeah, I was talking about limitation from the power center out, but you're
Yeah.
absolutely
Okay.
right. You're absolutely right.
Okay.
Absolutely right. Any other observations, comments from anyone around the tiles?
Well done, Paul.
Pat, we will turn things over to you. Screen sharing for you is turned on. So if you would like to take over from here, please do so. Looks like at the moment like you might be muted again.